Hello, Super Jardineros and friends. This is Ana Regalado from Verde, and welcome to our video series on plant propagation by seed. So this is going to be session 5 or part 2 about our video series on plant propagation. And today we're going to talk all about germination. So today we're going to try to answer a couple questions. So the first question that we're going to try to answer is, what is seed germination? What does that process entail? How does it start? How does it end? And everything in between. The second question we're going to try to answer is, what are the steps for seed germination, right? So what needs to happen before, what's happening during, and how do we know, when a seed is germinated? So to get started, let's talk about seed germination. So quite simply, seed germination is the process a seed undergoes to develop into a new plant, right? It's, similarly to how you would say baking is a process that batter would go to turn into a cake, germination is the process that a seed takes to turn into a plant. Just as simple as that. And when that happens, there are certain conditions that need to be met within the seed, right? Just like there are certain ingredients you need to put into a batter. There are certain things a seed needs to have to be able to be germinated. And there's also certain conditions that need to be met in its environment to trigger that process, right? So in a future video, we're going to talk all about the environmental conditions that need to be met for a seed to begin germinating. But for right now, let's talk a little bit more about what a seed needs to have to germinate. So before a seed even begins to germinate, it needs to have a few things, right? The first thing that it needs to have is a mature embryo. So think back to when we were talking about the seed anatomy and seed structure, right? There are 3 parts to a seed. There was the embryo, there was the endosperm, and there was the seed coat. Now, if you remember, the embryo is the part of a seed that contains all of the cells, all of the genetic information, right, to become a plant. So in a seed, first and foremost, that embryo needs to be mature. If it's underdeveloped, if it's too old and aged too long, that embryo is not going to be viable. So we need to have a mature and viable embryo within a seed to even begin the germination process. The second thing that a seed needs to have is it needs to have sufficient endosperm, right? So that second part of a seed is the endosperm. It is the part of a seed that gives the seed all of the energy and nutrients it needs to go through this process, right? Similarly to how a marathon runner or an athlete would, eat a lot of food or eat specific amounts of protein and things like that to prepare for, a race or a marathon, a seed needs to have a sufficient endosperm to prepare for germination. And if it doesn't have it, it's not going to have enough energy to germinate fully or to germinate properly. The next thing that a seed needs to have before it begins to germinate is sufficient hormones within that seed. So just like humans have hormones in our bodies that tell us to grow from an adolescent into an adult, seeds have hormones within themselves, within a seed, that tell it to go from a seed into a plant. So if we don't have sufficient levels of those hormones within a seed, that process can't be signaled to start taking place. So once a seed meets these 3 requirements, it has a mature embryo, it has sufficient endosperm, and it has sufficient hormones, then we can begin the seed germination process. So this process begins with the first step called imbibition. And imbibition is simply the rapid initial uptake of water, right? So when you place a seed into water, into a moist environment, that seed is going to start sucking up all that as much water as it can through its pores. And this process is called imbibition, and it is the first step to germination. And you can see that happening here in this swelled seed. So if you can tell, this seed has taken up water, its seed coat has begun to soften, and it's swelled up. So this is what happens during the imbibition phase. Now, it's important to note that this imbibition phase will occur in seeds that are viable and that are also not viable. So you can see here, there is a seed that's kind of moldy. It has some, gray or old parts, and this seed might not be viable, but it's still swelled and went through the imbibition phase. So it's important to remember that. And once a viable seed goes through the imbibition phase, the next step that that seed is going to take is it's going to go into the interim, sorry, there's a little bit of a typo there, or the lag phase. And this basically is when the seed processes inside the seed are starting to take place. You can't see much going on from the outside, but inside there's a lot happening, right? The hormones are starting to cause chemical changes within the seed. Things are starting to move around. Cells are starting to move around. A lot of things are happening. But one of the few things that you might see when this phase is happening is you might see the seed coat start to split, as you can see right here. You might also see a change in color. You might see a change in texture. There are a few things that you might be able to discern, but most likely the seed's not going to look like it's doing much, especially after that first imbibition phase where it grew to twice its size after swelling up with water. So after the interim or lag phase, the seed is going to go through its final step of seed germination if it's viable, which is the root radical emergence. And this is basically simply when the root radical, or the first part of the embryo, starts to emerge from the seed and from the seed coat. And we can see that happening here. If you take a close look, you'll see that this is the seed entirely, but right here we start to see where the embryo is, and we start to see this little tiny root start to come out of the seed. So this root initially was caused, you might be wondering, how did that root get there? Did it just pop up out of nowhere? Well, the root actually started growing, the root radical, through a single cell. And that cell swelled and grew and grew and grew in size. And as the root starts to grow down deeper into the soil, into the substrate or growing medium, it's going to continue to grow through cell division, so that those cells are going to start to split, right? And that's going to cause the root to get longer and longer and longer. And then once that root is fully grown and we start to see the embryo pop up, the leaves pop up, that is when germination is over and it starts to turn into a seedling, and that is when seedling growth takes over. So just to give a quick overview, the 3 steps to seed germination are imbibition, or the initial uptake of water. You can think of it as like a drinking phase or swelling phase as well. The interim or the lag phase, where not much is happening on the outside, but there's a lot of different chemical reactions and things taking place inside. And then the 3rd step is the root radical emergence, where we finally start to see that root start to pop up out of the seed and start to grow and get longer. So in this video, to wrap up, the questions that we answered are, what is seed germination? And we learned that that is the process of a seed developing into a new plant, quite simply, just like that, just how baking is the process of turning batter into a cake. Germination is the process of turning a seed into a plant. And what are the steps for seed germination? So the 3 steps that seed germination has are imbibition, which is the initial rapid uptake of water. It has the lag phase, where not much is happening on the outside, but there's a lot of chemical processes going on the inside, and the root radical emergence, where we start to see a root emerge from the seed. So now that we've talked all about what seed germination is and what are the steps, be sure to watch the next video in this series to learn more about the environmental factors that are going to affect seed germination. So I hope to see you in that next video. And if you have any questions at all about anything in this video, go ahead and comment below, or if you are a super jardinero, contact your coordinator. So contact Claudia or myself, and we're going to help you try to understand this information as much as possible. So thank you so much, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye, everybody.